So, good evening, everybody. We have a question and answer session tonight. For those living in areas under lockdown, we hope that you're doing well. It's a good opportunity to practice mindfulness every day, mindful of how disease or virus is transmitted. What are you doing with your hands through the day? If you're in a public area or workplace, they say that's how the disease is being transmitted around Melbourne. People being too close to each other, sometimes touching things and then not washing our hands, touching things in public places. I just heard the news. One of the architects who has helped the monastery over the years, Malcolm, has caught the disease, caught the virus, and with his wife, but luckily they only have mild doses. The symptoms are not too serious. But anyway, we wish them well, a full recovery. It's just a reminder that the virus is there, so it's something we have to be mindful of and work with during this time, and be patient with the frustrations of the lockdown. So what better to do than contemplate the Dhamma? So we have Q&A session tonight. You can contemplate the Dhamma to brighten our minds, give us more understanding, more inner peace from that. So, do we have a question?
Dear Luang Pa, say a family member focuses on the practices of meditation, chanting, and listening to the Dhamma teachings, and said to others that she has found peace on the path, and on the path she has found peace and is on the path to nirvana. However, that person does not look after the parents properly and does not acknowledge the reality in the world. What can we say, and how should I handle such a person?
Well, it's always difficult to know exactly what's going on in somebody else's mind. Their conduct, their actions reflect that to a certain extent. So, if someone is practicing Dhamma, chanting, meditating, listening to Dhamma, well, that's a good thing. If maybe they're still neglecting something else in their life, such as looking after parents, well, we would have the hope that through their practice they will become more aware, more sensitive, more compassionate, more mindful, and that would lead to more skillful action. It's better to be practicing the Dhamma, even if we're not perfect yet. We still have some limitations in our behavior, some faults, some weaknesses. Better to be practicing the Dhamma than doing something else. And they could be gambling, drinking, doing something that's really harmful to themselves or others. So if they're practicing the Dhamma, that's probably a good thing. But then we also have to look back at ourselves, because living in the world with other people, everyone is at their own level in their practice, and some people are more aware of what is their duty and what is really useful for them and others. Some people are less aware. We're all working through our karma. And so the Buddha gave us the Brahma Viharas, 4 Brahma Vihara practices for living in society with many kinds of people around us. Some people are advanced in their practice, some people are not. Some people don't understand the principles of Buddhist practice at all, or they just understand a little bit. So we develop goodwill for ourselves, for others, compassion for ourselves, for others, sympathetic joy, mudita citta, for ourselves, for others, And most important of all, but most difficult of all, is upekkha. Equanimity based on understanding of karma. And we have to accept, as we just chanted, we all are making our own karma and receiving the fruits of our own karma. And some people, we wish them well and we want them to learn and do things well, but maybe it's not happening yet. They're still working through their own problems, own issues. So we have to accept that with equanimity. And the same for ourselves. If you see faults or weaknesses in somebody else's behavior, you can feel compassion for them and hope that they practice more to get over their suffering, but also come back and look at yourself. Do I have those weaknesses? Say in the case of parents, if you feel another family member is not doing enough to help the parents, well, ask yourself, well, what are you doing for your parents? How much do you do? How much do you care about society and the duties and responsibilities we have towards society? You turn it around like this so that it's a cause for your own practice to develop, even if it's painful to live with people or seen people who maybe are not always doing the right thing. Come back and learn our own lessons, because that's where we can really change the world, is through our own efforts. So if someone else is showing a weakness, well, ask yourself, do I have that weakness? Have I developed that skill, that knowledge, that understanding? Am I performing that duty, that action correctly myself? And whether it's people we know or people we just hear about, that we can learn from others, but turn it back to yourself. Sometimes in the end all we can do is just get on with our own practice and hope that we're a good example for others and we learn. And in our meditation we can wish those people well, hope that they improve and find happiness and live skillful lives. But whether we can actually teach them or get them to understand more, it's quite often it's not possible. We're just not the one to tell them. They have to find their own teacher sometimes, and we're not the teacher. If we spend all our time trying to teach other people, we get very frustrated and maybe they get very annoyed with us, and it doesn't lead to much good sometimes. So get on with your own practice, and if you can help family members, that's good. But you also have to have equanimity, upekkha as well, and accept sometimes there's not a lot you can do to change them.
Dear Lumpur, my question today is about enlightenment. As I understand, the purpose of enlightenment is to end rebirth, so there is an end to our suffering. Do the suttas explain or describe what this is like, what it is like to be in this realm?
Well, from the words of the Buddha, we get a few simple ideas, like the end of suffering. Enlightenment, we say, is nibbana. Nibbana is described as the end of suffering, the extinction of suffering, which is what we all want. We all want perfect, lasting peace. So nibbana fulfills that. But the word nibbana in the language of Pali means extinction. So it was actually a term they used apparently in the time of the Buddha. It was a widely used term for the extinction or cooling down of things, and it could be used in more mundane ways. So like when a mother made some hot rice cakes or something, what they'd make in India, and her kid was there wanting to taste the freshly made cake, the kid would ask if the cake has attained nibbana yet before they ate it, because if it was too hot they couldn't eat it. So they want to know whether it's cooled down. And then apply the same thing to the human mind. The causes of our suffering, ignorance, craving, clinging, becoming, heat the mind up. And the Buddha said this attachment to this body and mind with ignorance is like being in a house on fire. Your mind is on fire because of greed, because of anger, delusion. We're always experiencing mental stress, mental pain, suffering. So Nibbana is the opposite of that. It's the cooling down, the extinction of the fire, because we've abandoned greed, anger, delusion. Ignorance has gone from the mind. So there are these sort of simple reflections that we get from the Buddha's words, but it's also something that is beyond words. It has to be experienced directly through our own practice. But the words give us a clue, give us the direction we're going in. So if you're doing any action that is leading to more stress and suffering in your mind, it's heating you up, you're getting hotter, we say more hot and bothered, more troubled, more agitated, then you're probably following a course of action that's going away from Nibbana. So it's a clue. Look at your mind as you live your life and see that when you're mindful in particular, mindfulness is such a valuable quality, because the more mindful you are, the more aware you become, the more self-restrained you become, the more self-controlled you become. Generally your mind cools down a bit. So if you're having an argument with someone and your sense of self arises, you have a particular view and you're arguing about it because they disagree with you, you feel emotionally hot, we say hot under the collar, getting worked up, getting agitated, maybe even physically expressing that. We sweat, we get tense. But if you have a moment of mindfulness during that argument, your mind starts to calm down, doesn't it? Cools down. If you have a moment of mindfulness, you ask yourself, what am I doing here? Is it worth arguing? Is it worth getting angry or upset, caught into this conflict? So as soon as you start to become mindful and gain clarity, your mind cools down. So this is why mindfulness is this sort of vehicle that will take us to Nibbana. But obviously we need wisdom as well, but mindfulness allows wisdom to function and work in our mind, because when we become aware, then we can see things more clearly and understand where craving and attachment are causing us suffering. So it might be simply accepting something that we have to accept, that we can't change. Maybe another person, they're not the same as us, their view is not the same as us. Why bother getting angry over them when their view is different? You just accept it, their view is different, and your mind goes quiet. It goes closer to Nibbana at that moment. Or maybe you have strong, obsessive kind of desire, some kind of addiction or some strong passion. I've really got to get this thing and then I'll be happy. But when you see through it with mindfulness and insight, you see, this desire is impermanent. It won't bring me ultimate happiness because it's impermanent, it's temporary. It's a conditioned thing. When your mind sees that, it calms down. Maybe it lets go of the desire and experiences a little Nibbana. So Nibbana, like you say, it's also the end of birth, not just the end of suffering in the mind in the present moment, but it's the end of birth, the end of the round of rebirth. So with no more ignorance, craving, attachment in the mind, there are no more conditions that will lead to rebirth. So that's it. The one who's attained Nibbana dies and there's no more birth. No more mothers have to go through the labour pains of giving birth to that being anymore. They not only help themselves, they help all those future mothers to be. They don't have to give birth again to that person. So, birth itself is painful, aging is painful, sickness is painful, coronavirus is painful, and death is painful. Nibbana is none of those things. Nibbana is beyond birth and death. It's the unborn, the uncreated, the unbound. The mind is no longer tangled up in the world. It's free from the world. So it's the best thing that humans can experience. So yes, the Buddha did talk a little bit about it, but he also pointed out that words alone won't get you there. You have to practice, free your mind from your wrong views, your delusions and attachments, and then you can experience nirvana directly.
Dear Luang Por, when I use recollection of the Buddha or of the noble ones in the Sangha as a meditation object, most of the time it will bring tears to my eyes. Is it suitable to use that meditation object frequently?
Yes, that sounds quite a suitable meditation object. I imagine those are tears of joy, piti, or rapture, which is quite common when the quality of faith comes up in our heart, in our mind. It's often accompanied by joy. We say piti and pamoja. These are wholesome qualities, wholesome emotions, positive emotions. And they can be accompanied, piti can be accompanied by various physical and mental experiences, such as the body and mind becoming very relaxed, feeling very light. So the heaviness of the body disappears, feelings of tiredness disappear. One can experience goosebumps, or one's hairs stand on end. One can experience tears forming in the eyes. Sometimes just the eyes water, sometimes tears flood out, depending on the experience. And the body can feel very light. The body can even feel like it's floating. So like when you might, if you're lucky enough, have met a teacher or recollected a teacher, remembered a teacher or remembered the Buddha, and so much piti and joy arises that you feel completely full, like a balloon that's been pumped up full of air. You feel completely full, light, buoyant, floating, and sometimes even literally like you're floating on air and the heaviness of the body is gone. So they sometimes compare when your mind is down in a negative, unwholesome state. It's not buoyed, it's not joyful, it's not floating. It feels heavy, dragged down. So it's like somebody in the ocean, they're sort of drowning in the ocean. But then when a moment of piti and sukha arises, maybe it's a moment of faith or a moment of mindfulness, recollecting something wholesome, like the qualities of a teacher, then the mind floats up. So it's like suddenly you've been given a life belt or a life buoy, and you're able to float on top of the ocean. So piti is a very important factor that comes up during the course of the practice, particularly through the development of samadhi. It's one of the factors of samadhi. But it can also come through recollecting teachers, and that in fact recollecting the qualities of a teacher. We call it sankhanusati. Mindfulness of the qualities of the Sangha can become a practice for people, and one can develop states of samadhi from that, and the piti, the rapture can become stronger, and maybe that's accompanied by tears. So usually that's a sign, if you're having that experience of piti, that's a good sign. Maybe that those recollections, that way of using your mind, at least for part of your meditation practice, is a good thing, it's a skillful thing. Many monks have found, practicing, particularly when you're practicing alone in the forest with very little to support you materially or spiritually, recollecting the teacher suddenly gives you a burst of energy. So you recollect a good teacher, or recollecting the Buddha could be the same. And where there was no joy, joy arises. Where there was no peace, peace arises. Where there was no mindfulness, suddenly one becomes very mindful, recollecting the teacher. So it can be one skillful way of bringing up energy and effort in the practice. So if you're lucky enough to, say, know a teacher like Ajahn Chah, or even if you just read his biography, you might find that sometimes you really, reading that biography or remembering that teacher, you get a burst of energy and you really feel committed to the practice because you're recollecting the quality of that teacher. So many of the monks who actually lived and knew Ajahn Chah, recollecting him, suddenly get this burst of energy and you're willing to push through the hindrances in the practice of meditation, you're willing to try harder. It can give you a great boost in the practice. Particularly with developing faith and developing samadhi. And then, of course, remembering the words of the teacher can help also. You know, the wise words of a teacher can help us cut through a delusion or an attachment. By simply recollecting the teacher, it brings us back to the present moment and maybe brings up a wholesome state that helps us through a situation. I remember one time when we built the eating hall at Ajahn Anand's monastery, and we were casting a Buddha statue in the monastery. There was a ceremony and people came to make this bronze Buddha, and there was all-night chanting in homage to the Buddha, and as they were boiling up the molten bronze for the next day when there would be the castings of the Buddha statue. They were boiling it overnight. So people were chanting the Dhammacakka Sutta all night long and the Parittas. And then during the ceremony there was a lot of chanting and all the monks were there, a lot of lay visitors were there. It was very hot because it was in the middle of the day, but everyone was chanting for about half an hour or an hour before the actual casting of the statue. So everyone was recollecting the Buddha. I remember recollecting the Buddha, we chanted the Vipassisa chant, one of the chants recollecting the previous Buddhas, the lives of the previous Buddhas, and just recollecting the fact that there have been so many Buddhas in the world, and those beings, bodhisattvas, who had practiced to become Buddhas and sacrificed so much, not only for themselves, but for the good of all beings, over and over again through samsara. I was just reflecting on that, and so the tears started to flow, and they started to flow kind of not uncontrollably, but much more than normal. And so they started flowing down my cheeks and then down my robe. And so after half an hour of chanting, my whole robe was completely soaked from tears. And in the crowd in front of us, there was one family sitting right in front of me, and they had a little girl with them who was maybe 5 years old. And during the chanting, I didn't know I had my eyes closed, but she started looking at me because the tears were rolling down my eyes, out of my eyes, down my cheeks. And she started pointing at me and grabbing her mother and saying, "Mum, Mum, Mum, look at the foreign monk." They call us Prat Farang in Thailand. "Look at the foreign monk, he's crying so much." And she just made a big deal out of it. So I just carried on chanting, and the tears kept rolling during the chant. Anyway, the little girl seemed to enjoy it. So sometimes it's like that. Piti and sukha arise when you recollect the Buddha or a teacher, and your mind becomes very firm in samadhi, but you may also experience these different kinds of piti. The most famous monk in Thailand for experiencing piti is possibly Ajahn Sao, who was Ajahn Mun's teacher. He's famous for having very profound experiences of piti, and sometimes in his meditation he'd actually levitate off the ground. His body and mind became so light, so bright, that he would actually float up, and he wasn't convinced he was really floating. He thought it was just a feeling or a perception in his mind. So he would test himself sometimes by placing a little matchbox up on the rafters of his meditation hut. And when he floated up, he actually mindfully put his hand out, picked up the matchbox and brought it back down again to ground level, just to prove he really had floated. Anyway, that's a rare kind of experience, but just to let you know it can happen.
Dear Ajahn, does the person himself know if they have attained the first path?
The first path, I guess you mean Sotapatti Pala, stream entry, the fruits of stream entry. Some maybe not. The thing is, when we're practicing, because we come from our background, the kind of culture we're in, the society we live in, we're always looking at results, the results of our efforts. So when we meditate, practice Buddhism, we learn, well, what does it mean to get results from your practice? Well, you want to gain samadhi, you want to gain insight, and if your samadhi and insight gel, then you might gain stream entry, first level of enlightenment, or second level, sakadagami, the once returner, or anagami, non-returner, or arahant, fully enlightened. We start thinking in that way, just as if you go to university or college, you're thinking of the degree you'll get, whatever certificate you'll get, which will help you to go on for further study or to get a job. Or if you get a job, you're thinking about getting skills so you can get promotion. Yeah, that's our cultural conditioning. So Buddhists are often thinking like that. But actually, as you practice, you're letting go of that desire that is mixed up with greed and craving, and you're more looking at just the causes of suffering and how to abandon them from your mind. So maybe somebody practices, develops the path, they've heard the teachings and they're putting their sincere efforts in. Maybe they already have abandoned the main first fetters which stop you from attaining enlightenment, which is what we call identity view or personality view, sakkaya ditthi, skeptical doubt, vicikicca, and then attachment to practices, external practices, rites and rituals, sila patiparamasa. Maybe they've already done that, following the instructions, practicing sincerely, but they're not thinking, have I done it yet? Am I a sotapanna yet? They're just doing it because they're practicing to free their mind from suffering and its causes. So they may progress to a certain extent on their path without really knowing for sure. They say really only the Buddha could give absolute confirmation as somebody attained stream entry or not. And the Buddha's not here now. So you can read the suttas, you can consult teachers, and you may get a good idea where you're at in the practice. But as Ajahn Chah always warned, it's never 100% sure. It's not sure. And a wise person will always keep a little space in the back of their mind that it's not sure. If I think I'm a sotapanna, maybe I am, but maybe I'm not. Or someone else, you think they're a sotapanna, maybe they are, or maybe they're not. If you have that little awareness of the uncertainty of these kind of labels and confirmations of attainment, you're aware, maybe not, then it's a very wise attitude to maintain through your practice, because one of the obstacles, and particularly on as you get progress further in your path, is one of the obstacles is the sense of self that forms around more subtle phenomena like experiences of samadhi, experiences of insight. The thought, yes, I have attained. Of course, nowadays you can go to meditation centers and get your certificate of sotapanna. I am a stream enterer. You can go on retreat, maybe pay some money, and you get your certificate, come home, put it on the wall, and you can be very happy. But a certificate is one thing. The actual direct experience of removing those fetters from your mind is another. So always be a little bit cautious about the part of the mind that wants to grasp at the results of the practice and identify with them, because that can actually become an obstacle. Even in the time of the Buddha, if I remember, there was one or two monks who weren't fully convinced that they had attained stream entry until the Buddha had to tell them. I think was Mahanama was one of them who maybe 2 or 3 times went to the Buddha with his doubts until the Buddha said, no, you're practicing correctly. And when he died, the other monks asked the Buddha, so did he attain the path? And the Buddha said yes. But in the end, the important thing is to know for yourself, isn't it? The Dhamma is what we call pachatang. We say pachatang veditabo vinyuhi, as we just chanted. The wise know for themselves. It's a personal experience, so be cautious, but know for yourself. And just keep practicing, listening to the Dhamma, respecting the noble Dhamma, the words of the Buddha and the noble ones. Keep trying to put them into practice, and it should bring you to good things.
Dear Ajahn, in Anapanasati meditation, the focus is on the in and out breathing. However, when I am practicing this method, there are many thoughts that arise in the background which make the mind wander. Can Tan Ajahn please advise what method I can use to abandon these arising thoughts?
Well, what you've just described, I think everybody experiences that. Craving and attachment, our defilements are sneaky. So you can be sitting there, straight, alert, convincing yourself you're practicing anapanasati, and maybe once in a while your mind does merge with the breath. But then for a lot of the time you can still be thinking, your mind is wandering around. You can be planning all kinds of things, remembering all kinds of things, really not very mindful of the breath. This is one of the problems. Our mind can just flip from one object to the next. So when our mindfulness and awareness is not yet strong, continuous, then it will do that. Whatever the meditation object, whether it's the breath or any other meditation object. So whatever meditation you're doing, your aim is always to bring up strong and continuous mindfulness and awareness with the object. And you have to work at it, and you have to be willing to be patient with the mind that does wander. So the breath itself is a very good method to train the mind, but you have to experiment for yourself and learn what works for you to bring more mindfulness, more peace. And so earlier we were talking about recollection of the Sangha, Sanghanusati. That can be one meditation. Recollection of the Buddha can be another. So we often use just one word for that, the word Buddho, the meditation word. So you're recollecting the Buddha, but you're sticking with Buddho. So when your mind loses Buddho and goes to the thinking process, gets carried away, or you know you've lost Buddho, as soon as you know that, you bring it back to the present moment and re-establish mindfulness on Buddho. Whatever meditation object you use, whether it's metta, bringing up the thought of goodwill directed to oneself and others, recollection of the Buddha, mindfulness of breathing, could be the contemplation of death, marananusati. But the aim is always to bring up mindfulness and cut through the distracted states of mind and the wandering mind. That takes a lot of effort, practice, and sometimes you have to adjust your approach. So if your mind is very stubborn and just keeps thinking about something, or maybe you have to be very tough. So like if you're doing anapanasati, threaten it a bit, be firm, stop breathing. Ajahn Chah used to say, just hold your breath. So if your mind is wandering all over the place, just stop breathing for a while, hold your breath. It brings your attention back to the breath, to the present moment, because you want to breathe. Everybody wants to breathe because we want to live. So it will cut through, at least for a few moments, it will cut through that wandering mind. Another one is to open your eyes, because often people find when they close their eyes in meditation and they're tired, especially meditating in the evening, like at this time, physically tired after a day's work or day's activity, it's very easy when you close your eyes for your mind just to wander, dream or fall asleep. So one simple antidote to that is just open your eyes for a while and let the light of the room you're in come and help to just re-establish awareness. Or Ajahn Chah used to say, light a candle in front of you and focus your mind on the candle if your mind is very dull and you're just thinking a lot. So there's many different techniques we use. I haven't got enough time to go into them all here, but your aim is to wake your mind up using your meditation and to cut through this habit of the distracted thinking mind wandering all over the place.
Okay, the last question this evening is, Dear Luang Pa, in the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 1, the Buddha said that a Puthujjana perceives earth as earth, while the Sikha directly knows earth as earth. What is the difference between perceives and directly knows?
Good question. Good sutta. So first sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya probably is a good one to read, isn't it? It's the first one. If I remember correctly, the Buddha is setting out the kind of progress in the practice from Puthujjana up to the different levels of enlightened beings up to the Arahant, and then even the Buddha, and the sort of the difference in the level of the mind, the presence or the lack of presence of defilement, greed, anger and delusion. Greed, anger and delusion manifests, often we use this phrase, sense of self, self-view, sense of self. So in that one, say, how the person perceives the earth. Well, if they're still a Puthujjana, means an unenlightened, ordinary person, they still have a mind that is conditioned by defilement, which comes up in the 5 hindrances, which we are working with and get familiar with as we meditate. So these 5 hindrances are what the Buddha said fuel our ignorance of truth, ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, ignorance of the true nature of phenomena, physical, mental phenomena. So the earth is just an example, physical phenomena. You know, this body is made up of earth element, fire element, water element, air element. So earth is one element. So you could say this body, you're focusing on earth, it's focusing on the body. So the unenlightened person perceives their body and they're still conditioned by greed, anger, delusion, mental defilement. So they perceive it wrongly. Their perception is distorted. So we have the distortions of perception, so distorted by greed, anger, delusion, or one of the fourth one they talk about is the perception of beauty. We see beauty in the earth where maybe it's not so beautiful. So like a human being, we look at ourselves, we're always looking for the good bits and we dislike the bad bits, the ugly bits. Look at other people, we always look and seek out the beauty and tend to ignore, overlook or discard the lack of beauty. So we, as unenlightened people, we get a distorted perception of the world through our senses. So seeing, from the minute, the second we see, already our perception is distorted because of the presence of previous defilements, conditioning the mind, the presence of ignorance. So we give importance to one thing and not to another, because our perception is distorted. It's not yet clear, pure. It's distorted. So if you're giving importance to one thing and not another, well, your mind will focus on one thing, and that's conditioning the mind, and that will condition the way you perceive the world. So, if you're a male walking down the street, unenlightened male, still subject to greed, anger, and delusion, not practicing the Dhamma, you see a female. Usually speaking, just generalizing here, usually speaking, you'll be looking, how attractive is she, or what are the attractive parts of her? And the unattractive parts you won't be noticing, maybe. Completely miss them. They're completely blurry or just out of your vision because they're not important to you. You've trained yourself to look for the good bits. And the same females for a male. He has this that is handsome, beautiful, attractive. Our perception gets distorted. And if we never practice mindfulness or investigate this, well, that process is constantly reinforcing itself. So we perceive Earth in a distorted way, beautiful, ugly, with a sense of self. So there's also this sense of ownership of that perception. My eye seeing this sight, it's me, or it's part of me, or it's the way I am, who I am, and so on and it goes. The distortions of perception lead on to views about the world, what is right and wrong, good and bad, what I like, what I don't like. It's a complex process, but in brief you could say our perception is distorted when we're unenlightened, without insight. But as we practice the Buddhist path, we're developing more mindfulness, restraint, and then discernment, developing wisdom through investigating and developing insight. And then you start to balance up your perceptions, they're not so distorted, and you're reconditioning your mind so you're not just fixated on one thing or another, not just giving importance to one thing or another, but you're able to look at things and appreciate the whole picture, the way things are, and particularly seeing the three characteristics of existence: anicca, dukkha, anatta, or impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and a lack of self in physical and mental phenomena. So in terms of physical phenomena, this body or the earth element, one develops insight to see, it's impermanent. What is impermanent is unsatisfactory, subject to degeneration, dissolution, doesn't last, can't give you lasting happiness, and it's a conditioned thing. It's not self. You can't own it or have it. It is not you. You're not in it. It's not part of you. You're not part of it, and so on. All these different views of self. These start to change through the development of insight, and so your actual way of perceiving or knowing the world changes to the point where the arahant no longer is just perceiving the world. They just know the world directly, through their experience in an undefiled way, with full clarity, full awareness. And because they've abandoned greed, anger, delusion, their perceptions are no longer defiled, so they just directly know things. So that's just a summary. So read that sutta, it's a good one to read, and then practice your meditation. Develop some mindfulness and insight, and maybe you'll find perception changes over time. Things that previously you thought were beautiful, desirable, attractive, that may change. Maybe your mind gets tired of attaching to things that you formerly thought were attractive, and you start to tire and let them go, and your perception starts to change. Perception towards earth element, or towards the body, physical phenomena, physical things, and then on the more subtle level, the mental things, even states of happiness, one's perception can change. One teacher talked about this. He said, just remember, when you were a little kid, like 1 year old, 2 years old, you'd do a poo and you might play with it. I can remember that. I can remember being in the bath with my siblings, and someone did a poo and we'd play around with it in the bath. This is like 1 and 2 years old. You don't see poo as something unattractive. It's kind of, you're curious. It can become a toy. Unfortunately, some kids even pick it up and eat it. I don't remember doing that myself, but I've seen other kids do it. It's that, your mind is just like that. It's playing around with poo. But a few years later, it's like, it becomes something disgusting. You wouldn't want it anywhere near you. You get rid of it quickly. It smells, it's unpleasant, it's embarrassing if you had it on you. Your whole perception changes, doesn't it? It's a bit like that. We have this fascination with the world and the things of the world. Our perception is distorted through love and hate for the world and the things of the world, for this body, mind, and the things of the world. But through the practice, that distortion starts to change and disappear. And the world is no longer such an alluring place. We no longer play with poo. So maybe on that note, I'll finish the Q&A session tonight.